Rome. All Western Europe was in chaos. Serious men thought the end of the world was at hand. The Church of Rome was almost the only vestige of organized civilization in the West to survive. Gregory threw himself into the struggle for order in the midst of chaos. During Gregory's time, the Church of Rome controlled approximately 1,800 square miles of land in Italy and Sicily, making it the richest landowner in Italy. When the Lombards invaded Italy and destroyed the imperial administration, church officials stepped in to feed the population and collect the land taxes, just as imperial officers had done. The head of the tax and welfare system was Gregory. He also undertook defense of central Italy against the Lombards, appointed a military governor, and arranged peace with 2 Lombard leaders. As a result, the Pope was more important in Lombard politics than any imperial representative. This participation in the political fortunes of Italy became significant for the papal office in the centuries that followed. After Gregory, the Pope was no longer only a Christian leader, he was an important figure in European politics, God's consul. With Gregory, monasticism ascended the papal throne. He continued the austere monastic life, surrounded himself with monks, making them bishops and legates, confirmed the rule of St. Benedict at a council of Rome, guaranteed the liberty of property of convents, and by his example and influence rendered the highest service of the monastic life. Gregory took seriously his calling as defender of orthodoxy. He formulated the common faith of his day and handed it on to the Catholic Church of the Middle Ages. This faith embraced not only the official pronouncements of the councils and the teachings of the fathers, but also the notions of the illiterate people, which was often crude and superstitious, even pagan. It's impossible to follow the thinking of the Middle Ages without the guidance of Gregory. His doctrine stood on the following. Adam's fall affected all his descendants, weakening but not destroying their freedom of will. Thus, once man has been moved by grace, he may cooperate with it and win merit for himself by his good works, the joint product of divine grace and human will. In baptism, God grants forgiving grace freely without any merit on man's part. But for sins committed after baptism, man can make atonement by penance, a form of punishment inflicted by the man himself instead of by God. Penance involves sincere repentance from the heart, confession, and meritorious works. Meritorious works without which penance is not complete are deeds involving sacrifice or suffering, such as almsgiving, ascetic practices, and prayers at all hours of the day. The greater our sins, the more we must do to make up for them, and the more careful we must be to avoid them in the future. Whether we have done enough to atone for them, we cannot know until after death. Sinners have the help of the saints to help them in prayer and to protect them in their guilt. Gregory encouraged the collection and veneration of the holy relics, remains of the saints and martyrs, such as hair, fingernails, toes, pieces of clothing, etc. He taught that these items possess great powers, including that of self-defense. And you know, some of those things are still circulating today. They really are. Catholics would flock to them, you know. If the saints and the relics were not sufficient for righteousness in this life, sins could still be atoned in purgatory, a place of purification and suffering, not for those who die with serious offenses still charged against them, but for those who are not yet altogether religious. At death, the perfectly holy go at once to heaven and the wicked to hell, while those of an intermediate character who still have minor sins for which penance must be done spend a season in purgatory. This is where even Christian churches get the idea that there are big sins and little sins. You know, it's this, you know what I'm saying? A lot of Christian churches, you know, it's like we were talking about during the break earlier, you know, they cannot handle divorce, but they'll tolerate murder. You know, and out of that same concept, you know, it's like this. You see a lot of little sins tolerated in church, like gossip, which according to the Bible is one of the biggest sins. But churches view it as a small sin. So you can commit small sins, but not big sins. In other words, like God judges sin, but that's not what the Bible teaches. The Bible teaches sin is sin. And all sin separates you from God and needs to be repented of. An alliance between the Franks and the papacy in the 750s affected the course of European politics and Christianity for centuries. It accelerated the separation of the Latin from the Greek church by giving the papacy a dependable Western ally, and it created the Papal States. which played a major role in Italian politics until the late 19th century. And by ritual anointing, it provided Western kingship with a religious sanction that would eventually contribute to rivalry between Pope and Emperor. Pope Boniface crowned Pepin king of the Franks pursuant to Pepin's request for assistance in legalizing the regal power exercised by majors of the palace. In return, Pepin provided armed intervention against the Lombards, threatening to take Rome. Pepin also officially conferred the Ravenna territory upon the Pope. The donation of Pepin made the Pope a temporal ruler over the Papal States, a strip of territory that extended diagonally across Italy from coast to coast. Only one significant step was needed to restore the Christian empire to the West, and that came with the rise to power of Pepin's son, Charles. Today he is known as Charlemagne, the Charles the Great. When Charles succeeded his father in 768, his mind was set on three goals: military power to crush his enemies, religious power to direct people's souls, and intellectual power to instruct both souls and minds. His success in these areas made Europe the new political order, nominally Christian for 1,000 years. Charlemagne sought to extend Christendom and mounted several campaigns to remove various enemies and extend the borders of his influence. He was successful in his efforts, and at the Pope's request intervened in Italian politics. The Lombards were threatening Rome once again. The Pope needed protection, and Charlemagne needed divine sanction. In 799, on Christmas Day, Charles came to St. Peter's with a large retinue for the Christmas worship. As he was on his knees before the crypt of the apostle, the Pope placed a golden crown upon his head as the congregation cried, "To Charles, the most pious, crowned Augustus by God. To the great peacemaking emperor, long life and victory." So the Pope prostrated himself. Charles the Great, king of the Franks, had restored the Christian Roman Empire. Charles engrafted the Christian concept of a universal Catholic Church on the stock of the traditional Roman view of empire and gave the medieval world Christendom, a united society mingling religious concerns with earthly affairs. The king that Jesus said was not of the world became part of the worldly power. Charles said that he did not know his coronation as emperor was planned, but he lived up to it. He began his dispatches. Charles, by the will of God, Roman Emperor Augustus. The coronation initiated a long-standing struggle between the revived empire and the papacy. In medieval theory, church and state were but two aspects of Christendom, one representing Christian society organized to secure spiritual blessings, the other united to safeguard justice and human welfare. Theoretically, church and state were harmoniously aiming to secure the good of mankind. In reality, the Pope and Emperor were contestants. Should the church rule the state, or should the state control the church? Since time depended upon eternity, the papal party held by the emperor depended upon the Pope. But since Constantine and Charlemagne revealed that God also ordained the Christian state, the imperial party argued that the emperor was independent of the Pope. And if the Holy Father neglected his eternal office in time, the emperor might even correct or control the Pope. Everyone in Charlemagne's reign was answerable to him. To solve problems, he created the Macedomonici, the king's envoys. Pairs of these officials, usually a bishop and a lay noble, traveled throughout the realm to check on local administration. Even the Pope could not hide from his watchful eyes. Charlemagne promoted learning and the arts and decreed that every monastery must have a school for the education of boys in singing, arithmetic, and grammar. After 3 centuries of disorder, he restored a measure of law and order. His patronage of learning left a cultural heritage and that later generations could build upon. The imperial ideal he revived persisted as a political force in Europe until 1806, when the Holy Roman Empire was terminated by Napoleon Bonaparte. Charlemagne extended Christian civilization in Europe. After Charlemagne's death, the empire disintegrated amid the confusion of civil wars and devastating new invasions. The Vikings began sweeping out of the Northland, and people increasingly surrendered their lands and their persons to the many counts, dukes, and other local lords in return for protection. These disintegrating conditions presented a new challenge called feudalism to the church and to the unity of Europe. Feudalism was a type of government in which political power was exercised locally by private individuals rather than by the authorities of a centralized state. It was a fusion of three basic elements. The first one being the personal element called lordship or vassalage, by which one nobleman, the vassal, became the loyal follower of a stronger nobleman or lord. Secondly, the property element called the fief, usually land, which the vassal received from his lord to enable him to fulfill the obligations of vassalage. And thirdly, the governmental element, meaning the private exercise of governmental functions over vassals and fiefs. The roots of these elements ran back to the late Roman and early Germanic times. Central to feudalism was the personal bond between lord and vassal. The feudal contract between lord and vassal was considered sacred and binding upon both parties. Breaking this was considered a felony. Since the church was so much a part of medieval life, it could not escape inclusion of the feudal system. Church officials were forced to enter into close relations with the feudal barons in France and the kings of Germany in order to receive protection. This loyalty to lords created unusual conflicts for those bishops who looked to the people, to the Pope, as God's appointed shepherd of the church. In the 10th and 11th centuries, the Pope was in no position to challenge anyone. The office fell into decay after becoming a prize sought by local Roman nobles. On the positive side, the church sought to add Christian virtues to the code of knightly conduct called chivalry. And the church tried to impose limitations on, feudal warfare. In the 11th century, bishops inaugurated the peace of God and the truce of God movements. Unfortunately, both movements were generally ineffective. The peace of God banned those who pillaged sacred places or refused to spare non-combatants from receiving the sacraments. The truce of God established closed seasons on fighting, from sunset on Wednesday to sunrise on Monday in certain longer periods such as Lent. During the 11th century, the controversy between church and state centered on the problem of lay investiture. Theoretically, on assuming an office, a bishop or an abbot was subject to investitures. His spiritual authority was bestowed by church official and his feudal or civil authority by the king or noble. In actual fact, feudal lords and kings came to control both the appointment and the installation of churchmen. This practice was most pronounced in Germany, where control of the church was the foundation of the king's power. In essence, the German church was the state church. The church was not prepared to challenge kings and emperors, and it needed to set its own house in order. This began a far-reaching revival within the Reformed Benedictine order of Cluny, founded in 910. The Cluniac program began as a movement for monastic reform, but in time it called for the enforcement of clerical celibacy and the abolition of simony, the purchase or sale of a church office. The ultimate goal was to free the entire church from secular control and subject it to papal authority. Some 300 Cluniac houses were freed from lay control, and in 1059 the papacy itself was removed from secular interference by the creation of the College of Cardinals, which elected the popes. The man behind the reform of the papacy was Archdeacon Hildebrand. In 1073 he was elected pope, and as Gregory VII in 1073 to 1085 he claimed unprecedented power for the papacy. He insisted that spiritual power was supreme over the temporal, and in 1075 he prohibited lay investiture, threatening to excommunicate any layman who performed it and any churchman who submitted to it. This drastic act virtually declared war against Europe's rulers and resulted in the clash between Gregory and Emperor Henry IV. The Pope accused Henry IV of simony and lay investiture in his appointment of his choice to be the Archbishop of Milan. Henry's answer was to convene a synod of German bishops in 1076 that declared Gregory unfit to occupy the Roman see and renounced all obedience to him. In retaliation, Gregory excommunicated Henry and disposed him, absolving his subjects from their oaths of allegiance. Isn't that funny? A revolt of the German nobles forced Henry to appear before Gregory in January 1077. Dressed as a penitent, the emperor stood barefoot in the snow for 3 days. and begging forgiveness until Gregory received him back into the church. This dramatic humiliation of the emperor did not resolve the quarrel. However, the Pope made progress toward freeing the church from interference by laymen and toward increasing the power and prestige of the papacy. The problem of lay investiture was resolved by the compromise known as the Concordat of Worms in 1122. The church maintained the right to elect the holder of an ecclesiastical office, but only in the presence of the emperor or his representative. Later popes added little to Gregory's theories of office. Many of his claims now appear intolerable. However, he and his successors stood for two principles that are incontestable to the Christian. Number one, in the loyalties of men, the spiritual has the primacy over the secular. And secondly, families of men can find true unity only in Christ and in obedience to the law of God. During the Middle Ages, Europe became conscious of itself as a unity, and the church attained a level of power and influence over the lives of men such as it had never known since that time. During the 12th and 13th centuries, the papacy led an attempt to constitute a perfect society on earth. The church achieved incomparable power and majesty. Like the Gothic cathedral, the medieval church shot upward into the heavens, calling all below it to the glory of God. But like the cathedrals, the papacy reached for the impossible and first cracked, then in time crumbled to earth. Between 1170 and 1270, more than 500 great Gothic-style churches were built in France alone. Early Gothic builders tried to attain the utmost height possible with the materials at hand. By reaching the greatest height possible, the architect tried to create the illusion of soaring and demonstrated man's desire to reach upward to God. The Pope's government was a truly universal monarchy, steadily becoming more centralized. All bishops swore loyalty to the Pope. No religious order could be founded without his authorization. The papal court in Rome heard appeals from all over Christendom, and legates from Rome watched over the execution of papal orders in every country. The papacy could overshadow all secular monarchs in the hands of a strong leader. Pope Innocent III, 1198 to 1216, announced, "The successor of Peter is the vicar of Christ. He has been established as the mediator between God and man. Below God, but beyond man. Less than God, but more than man. Who shall judge all and be judged by no one?" Innocent III told the princes of Europe that the papacy was like the sun, while kings were like the moon. As the moon received its light from the sun, so kings derived their powers from the Pope. The papacy's chief weapons in support of this authority were spiritual penalties. Thus, the Pope's first weapon in bringing peasants and princes to their knees was the threat of excommunication. Almost everyone believed in heaven and hell and in the Pope's management of the grace to get to one and avoid the other. After reading the solemn sentence of excommunication, a bell rang as for a funeral. A book was closed and the candle was extinguished. Dramatic, amen. All to symbolize the cutting off of the guilty man. If he entered a church during Mass, he was expelled or Mass was halted. While under excommunication, persons could not act as a judge, a juror, a witness, or an attorney. They could not be guardians, executors, or parties to contract. After death, they received no Christian burial. And if by chance they were buried in consecrated ground, the church had their bodies disinterred and destroyed. That's a loving church. The second weapon was the interdict or ecclesiastical lockout. While the excommunicant was aimed at individuals, the interdict fell upon whole nations, suspending all public worship, and with the exception of baptism and extreme unction, it withheld the sacraments from the lands of disobedient rulers. Pope Innocent III successfully applied or threatened the interdict 85 times against uncooperative princes. Wielding these spiritual weapons, Innocent and his successors in the papal office during the 13th century led Christianity to its peaks of political and cultural influence. That's evil, you know it? Using the devil to build the church. Taking up the cross of Christ. The Crusades reflected the new dynamism in Western Christianity. Driven by religious fervor, love of adventure, and dreams of personal profit, Crusaders from Western Europe attempted to expel the Muslims from the Holy Land for 200 years. For centuries, peaceful pilgrims had been traveling from Europe to worship at the birthplace of Christ. The rise and the spread of Islam in the Near East during the 7th century did not interrupt this traffic. By the 10th century, bishops were organizing mass pilgrimages to the Holy Land. The largest of these set out from Germany in 1065. It included about 7,000 pilgrims. During the 11th century, however, Christian pilgrims began to encounter persecution. Seljuk Turks seized Jerusalem from their fellow Muslims and then swept north into Asia Minor. The Turks captured the Eastern Emperor in 1071 and scattered his army. Within a few years, the chief source of Byzantine revenue and troops was lost, and the emperor was writing to Western princes and the Pope seeking mercenaries to aid in the rescue of lost territories. In addition, alleged tales of Turkish mistreatment of Christian pilgrimage were circulated throughout Europe, most of which could not be validated. But the rumors themselves were enough to inflame men's minds. In 1095, after the Eastern Emperor Alexius I sent out an urgent appeal for help, Pope Urban II proclaimed the First Crusade to regain the Holy Land, urging Christians to take up the cross and strive for a cause that promised not merely spiritual rewards but material gain as well. Deus Vult, God's will, God wills it, became the Crusader battle cry against the Muslim enemy. The word crusade comes from taking the cross after the example of Christ on the way to the Holy Land. The Crusader wore the cross on his breast. On his journey home, he wore it on his back. The Crusades were a new type of war, a holy war. Augustine had laid down the principles of a just war. It was conducted by the state. Its purpose was the vindication of justice, meaning the defense of life and property. And its code called for respect for non-combatants, hostages, and prisoners. All these evaporated in the heat of the holy cause. Somehow the high calling excused the total disregard for non-combatants and prisoners. Crusades ignited horrible attacks against the Jews. Even fellow Christians were not exempt from rape and plunder. Incredible atrocities befell the Muslims. Dead bodies were sawn open in search of gold, and sometimes crusaders cooked and ate their flesh. Delicacy found better than spiced peacock, as one chronicle put it. Yeah. 7 major crusades and several small expeditions were launched by Christian Europe and led by the popes from the end of the 11th century to the end of the 13th. The first and most successful crusade overcame the resistance of the Turks, who were no longer united with not more than 5,000 knights and infantry. It captured the holy city, Jerusalem. Some of our men cut off the heads of their enemies. Others shot them with arrows so that they fell from the towers. Others tortured them longer by casting them into the flames. It was necessary to pick one's way over the bodies of men and horses. But these were small matters compared to what happened in the Temple of Solomon. Men rode in blood up to their knees in bridle reins. Indeed, it was a just and a splendid judgment of God that this place should be filled with the blood of the unbelievers, since it had suffered so long from their blasphemies. A long strip of territory was captured along the eastern coast of the Mediterranean and created the feudal Latin kingdom of Jerusalem. It survived until 1291, when its last remnant fell to the Muslims. When the kingdom of Jerusalem faced its first crisis in 1147, Bernard, the powerful mystic of Clairvaux, called for the Second Crusade. This crusade achieved nothing, and after 2 years simply melted away. In 1187, Saladin, Sultan of Egypt and Syria, brought new leadership to the Muslims, and when Jerusalem fell, Christians reluctantly responded to the cry for the Third Crusade. Its leaders were 3 of the most famous medieval kings, Frederick Barbarossa of Germany, Richard the Lion-Hearted of England, and Philip Augustus of France. Eventually, a 3-year truce and free access to Jerusalem for Christian pilgrims was agreed upon. Over the years, the Crusades revealed the harsh realities of papal aspirations in the East and the degradation of crusading zeal. The era of the Crusades ended in 1291 when Acre, the last stronghold of the Christians in the land where Jesus walked, fell to those who denied his deity. In the Middle Ages, sins had to be confessed to be forgiven. Upon hearing a confession, the priest not only pronounced the penitent's guilt for sin forgiven, through the merit of Christ, but also required a penalty or satisfaction, some act of penance. as a mark of the person's sincerity. For years, the church claimed the power to remit part of this temporal punishment. But no complete remission had been granted until Urban II offered total remission or indulgence for crusaders who headed for Jerusalem out of a pure devotion. Soon, these benefits were conferred upon those unable to go on a crusade but contributed to the cause. A man could virtually buy a substitute, resulting in possibilities for fundraising for construction of hospitals and cathedrals. If the primary purpose of the Crusades were to win the Holy Land, to check the advance of Islam, and to heal the schism between the Eastern and the Western churches, then the Crusades failed miserably. For a time, 4 kingdoms led by Jerusalem were established along the Eastern Mediterranean coast of the Holy Land. In these Crusades created 3 semi-monastic military orders. The Templars, or the Knights of the Temple, whose headquarters were on this site of the old Temple of Jerusalem. The Hospitallers, or Knights of St. John of Jerusalem, who were originally founded to take care of the sick and wounded. And the Teutonic Knights, exclusively a German order. Combining monasticism and militarism, these orders' aims were the protection of all pilgrims and perpetual war against the Muslims. For 2 centuries, the Templars in white robes, decorated with a red cross, the Hospitallers in black robes with a white cross, and the Teutonic Knights in white robes with a black cross were common sights in the Crusader states. The most significant result was the added splendor the Crusades brought to the papacy. The popes, not the emperors, strove to unite Christendom against Islam. The new military orders and new bishops in the Holy Land were under papal protection and service. The Holy War was the papacy reaching for universal sovereignty, one united church, west and east. Unfortunately, the popes never held 2 basic truths. Christianity's highest satisfaction is not guaranteed by possession of special places, and the sword is never God's way to extend Christ's church. This fault assured the religious collapse of the whole structure. Schools in the Gothic cathedrals gave birth to medieval universities. For the supreme task of the university was to understand and explain the light of God's revealed truth. Just as the Crusades revealed a passion to extend the authority of God in Muslim lands, so the universities revealed an intense hunger to understand the truth of God received from any land. The period in the history of Christian thought called scholasticism came into being because a distinctive method of scholarship arose and because a unique theology of the Middle Ages emerged. The aim of schoolmen, as these teachers were called, was twofold: to reconcile Christian doctrine with human reason, and to arrange the teachings of the church in an orderly system. A free search for truth was never in view, since the chief doctrines of the Christian faith were regarded as fixed. The purpose of discussion was to show the reasonableness of the doctrines and explain their implications. Living religiously in a studious manner was the hallmark of medieval education. Its central aim was eternal salvation. Originally, learning had been limited primarily to the clergy. Later in the 8th century, Charlemagne, dreaming of a Christian empire, had widened the opportunities for study through a decree that every monastery have a school to teach all those who, with God's help, are able to learn. The best chance for learning among laymen during this period came from cathedral schools. The curriculum was limited to grammar, rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. The first texts available were writings of a handful of scholars of the early Middle Ages, along with those of Augustine, Pope Gregory the Great, and a few other church fathers. These writings were known as auctores, or authorities, whose words the medieval student did not presume to contradict. A new day dawned with the coming of the greatest schoolmasters. The birth of universities can be traced to the magnetism of single teachers whose skill and enthusiasm for learning attracted students wherever they happened to be. The first of this new breed was Gerbert, master of the cathedral school in Reims in the latter half of the 10th century. The son of a serf, he was destined to end his days as a pope, Sylvester II. However, he left a deeper mark upon history through his scholarship. His brilliance was recognized early in his student career, and his abbot sent him to Spain to study mathematics. There he was exposed to the broad and tolerant culture of the ruling Muslims. This was the first of a number of significant contributions Muslims made to the Christian intellectual awakening. Gerbert returned to Reims deeply impressed by the inquisitive, questioning spirit of Muslim scholarship. When he began to teach, he announced that quotations of traditional church authorities no longer sufficed. His pupils were to study the Roman classics in the original. He built a sizable library, which was quite an accomplishment at the time when a manuscript sometimes took a year to copy and cost at least the equivalent of a churchman's yearly income. The liveliest figure was Peter Abelard, who in his treasure entitled Sic et Non, Yes or No, he posed 158 questions from Christian teaching and answered them with conflicting quotations from the Scriptures, the Church Fathers, and the pagan classics. The first key to wisdom is assiduous and frequent questioning. For by doubting we come to inquiry, and by inquiry we arrive at the truth. One of his books on the nature of the Trinity invoked condemnation by a church council in 1121, and he was sent to spend the rest of his days in a monastery. He repeatedly found himself in trouble with church conservatives, including Abbot Bernard of Clairvaux, who preached the faith of the righteous believes, it does not dispute. A church council in 1140 condemned Abelard for heresy. The event that marked the flowering of the universities was the grouping of students and masters into guilds. Scholars banded together for mutual interest and protection and called themselves a universitas, the medieval name for any corporate group. Students hired and paid teachers determined the courses to be given and fined any lecturer who skipped a chapter in expounding on his subject. A French and English universities where the students were younger, masters' guilds had the upper hand. They forbade students to swear or gamble, fined them for breaking curfews, and prescribed table manners. Cleanse not the teeth with the steel that is sharpened for those that eat with thee. Medieval universities did not have any type of permanent buildings. At first, lectures were given in wayside sheds at Oxford and Cambridge, in the cathedral cloisters in Paris, and in the squares in Italy. In time, teachers rented rooms and students sat on the floor covered with straw against the dampness. These groups could pick up and move elsewhere at any time if they found themselves at odds with local citizens. In addition to lectures, the methods of teaching was disputation. Two or more masters, and occasionally the students, debated text readings using Abelard's question and answer approach. Scholasticism developed in this text and came to stand for painstaking arrival at logical conclusions through questioning, examining, and arranging details into a system of logic. This method stirred heated clashes and bitter feelings at times. Wars of logic ran for years between master, and students of each cheering their hero with tumultuous stomping and whistling. Something important was happening. Students were learning to think. Unquestioning acceptance of traditional authorities was no longer assured, but the conclusions had to agree with Christian doctrine. All the activity of the universities occurred under the watchful eye of the papacy. Some debates continued for generations, but the Pope made sure that the net result was a new philosophical framework supporting the papal monarchy. On one hand was a new formulation of canon law. On the other hand, a systematic statement of Christian theology. Canon law served the church just as civil law supported a secular government. It defined the rights, duties, and powers of all people and priests within the church. It was the law administered in all ecclesiastical courts, from those of the bishops up to that of the Pope. Around 1140, Gratian, a monk, published a harmony of discordant canons, which tried to coordinate all previous collections of church law. Since he arranged his quotations of authorities by subject, his harmony soon emerged as the sole manual for teachers and judges in the church. It served as the base for latter additions to the body of canon law. In the 14th century, the Roman Church had at its disposal until 1980, when it was revised, an authoritative body of laws to control and direct the lives of men. Canon law interfered in wars, recognized the care of widows, decreed fasting and feasting, ordained confession and communion at least once a year, and specified which actions excommunicated a Christian from the church. It also directed man's most intimate relationships. Canon law reached every priest and every layman, plowman, or prince. It professed to declare not only the necessary path to salvation, but the very nature of the most intimate organs of men and women. This craving to control may have disguised the fatal flaw in Christianity by law. It tried to reduce human freedom to a miserable minimum and forgot that God designed freedom as the forerunner for the coming of true faith. Canon law gave the papacy a rational legal basis, something the medieval state did not possess. As a result, the papacy rose to preeminent power in public life of Europe and achieved international prestige. On the day of Innocent III's consecration, the sermon text was Jeremiah 1:10. I have this day set thee over the nations and over the kingdoms, to root out, to pull down, to destroy and throw down, to build and to plant. And that's what he did for 3 decades. He was the vicar of Christ on earth, thanks in large part to the universal authority conveyed in canon law. The universities also served the papacy by providing an unshakable, rational theological construction of Christian society. By the 13th century, the writings of the ancient Greeks were pouring into Europe, undermining faith and prompting heresies. Aristotle's works were now available, and his doctrines on the nature of the universe were leading men to doubt revelation. Works of the Muslim philosopher Averroes and the Jewish philosopher Maimonides were spreading skepticism. To quiet the uproar, Thomas Aquinas in 1224 to 1274 was sent to Paris from Italy. He was a Dominican monk with a brilliant mind and gentle disposition. Like Abelard, he honored reason above all other human attributes. But he had distinguished himself for his fidelity to the church as well as his scholarship. Rather than renouncing Averroes, Maimonides, and Aristotle, he examined their writings point by point, refuting some and reconciling others with Christianity. The result was his Summa Theologica, a summation of theological knowledge. Thomas says at the beginning in Sacred Doctrine, all things are created from a standpoint of God, and the content of theology is in part God himself, and in part other beings, in as far as they are ordained unto God. Aquinas made a distinction between philosophy and theology, reason and revelation. But there is no contradiction between the two. Both are fountains of knowledge. Both come from God, the same God. The two differ in their methods and in searching after truth. Reason is based upon the visible creation and can reach ideas that deal with the vestibule of faith. Revelation looks to God as he is in himself, and so is superior to reason both in its certainty and in its subject matter. For example, reason can prove God's existence. Accepting Aristotle's principle, every effect has a cause, every cause a prior cause, and so on back to the first cause. Aquinas declared that creation traces back to a divine first cause, the Creator. However, the full knowledge of God, the Trinity, for example, comes only through revelation. From this knowledge, we discover man's origin and destiny. Aquinas' system aimed at a perfect harmony between the aspirations of man and the light of God's truth. It provided the papal monarchy an impressive supernatural view of this world and the next. Like the Crusades, scholastic theology may have reached too far and claimed too much for itself and the church. Innocent III's claim that the Pope is the judge of the world, set in the midst between God and man, below God and above man, was challenged by a growing host of laymen and who remembered the apostolic testimony. There is one God and one mediator. Amen. Let's see. The medieval poverty movement is a reminder that political Christianity is only partial Christianity. The Christian faith is more than papal policy, much more. The gospel of voluntary poverty drew its strength from a deep and widespread resentment of a corrupt and neglectful priest. The Back to the Apostles movement was often allied with political and economic restlessness in a rapidly changing and expanding society. But at its heart was the spiritual hunger of people. Pastoral care was a lost art. Robert Grosseteste, Bishop of London in 1235 to 1253, spoke out vehemently against the covetousness, the greed, and the immorality of the clergy. He blamed the problem on the Roman court, which he said appoints not pastors but destroyers of men. As early as the 10th century, monastic reformers called for return to the poverty of the early church. Every zealous preacher knew if apostolic poverty is the Christian ideal, then bishops in their embellished palaces and monks in their wealthy cloisters were not living the Christian life. In the 12th and 13th centuries, not all preachers of apostolic poverty were willing to remain within the acceptable boundaries of the church. When they turned against the church, they entered the ranks of the heretics. Medieval Christians did not consider faith strictly private. Christian beliefs were the cement of society, and denial of a single article was equal to treason. Christendom was a socio-political body, and the Christian faith was its life-giving soul. So heresy in Christendom was no more acceptable than cancer in the flesh. Heresy in the 12th century was a denial by a baptized person of any revealed truth of the Christian faith. Among these truths were the unity of the church and the divine appointment of the Pope as the head of the Christian body. Therefore, disobedience to established authority was itself heresy. The faith was hardly what the Apostle Paul meant by the term, but it was generally effective for sustaining the body. Christendom did not have to believe, only to believe in belief. The church had two primary objectives in dealing with heresy. Number one was conversion of the heretic, and secondly, protection of Christian society. Heresy drove the Catholic Church to her most serious internal conflict. How can the church employ violence to safeguard a peaceful society? And the church deliberately accepted a line of action all but impossible to reconcile with the eternal kingdom she represented. She created the Inquisition, not only to execute heretics, but to subject them to deliberate and prolonged torture. The same church that sent the crusading armies against the infidels could command the burning of heretics. Almost everyone agreed that a pure church was the will of God. But in driving out one devil, the church opened the door for 7 others. Where is the one pure church? Is it in the papal palace in Rome? Is it in the blood of crusading armies? Or in the sale of indulgences to the poor? What if the one pure church is none of these, but is in fact in the hungry who find bread, the naked who are clothed, the stranger who finds rest? What if the kingdom of heaven does belong to the poor in spirit? These were the questions Lady Poverty raised. One of the earliest voices against worldliness in the Catholic Church was Arnold in northern Italy. He insisted that clerical vice was a result of the church's attempt to control the world. He urged the church to surrender its property and secular dominion to the state and return to the poverty and simplicity of the early church. In 1139, Arnold succeeded in turning the people against their bishop, and the Pope banished Arnold from Italy. After 5 years in exile, he returned to Rome and joined a movement to overthrow papal dominion. The Romans seized power during the Pope's preaching tour for the Second Crusade, and Arnold stepped into leadership of the new purely secular government. He preached that clergy should live in apostolic poverty and denounced the College of Cardinals as a den of thieves. After 10 years, Pope Hadrian IV placed Rome under interdict and secured the help of Emperor Frederick Barbarossa in capturing Arnold. In 1155, he was executed by burning, and his ashes were thrown in the Tiber River. Soon after, another voice for poverty arose in France. Peter Waldo, a rich merchant of Lyons, had sought out a priest to learn how to live like Christ. The priest gave him the answer Jesus gave the rich young ruler. If you be perfect, go and sell what you possess and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. Come and follow me. Waldo followed his counsel. He provided an adequate income for his wife, placed his 2 daughters in a cloister, and gave the rest of his estate to the poor. To launch his mission to the poor, Waldo enlisted 2 priests to translate portions of the Bible into French. He began to teach common folk to imitate Christ by practicing voluntary poverty. His revolutionary idea centered upon applying the life of poverty and discipleship to all true Christians, not just monks. Waldo sent his followers out 2 by 2 to spread the message. His unauthorized preaching soon met stiff opposition, and he was ordered to stop by the Archbishop of Lyons. However, Waldo refused, quoting Peter, "We must obey God rather than men." Proceedings to execute Waldo were commenced by the Archbishop, but Waldo and his followers appealed to the Pope. Pope Alexander III found no evidence of heresy among them and was impressed by their poverty. They were laymen. However, so he ruled, they could preach only by invitation of bishops. Waldo was convinced that the Scriptures commanded him to preach to the poor with or without the bishop's approval. In 1184, their disobedience compelled Pope Lucas III to excommunicate them from the Holy Catholic Church. Under Waldo's leadership, the Waldenses wanted to purify the church by a return to the simple life of the apostles. This meant the surrender of worldly power. Their aim, like that of the Roman Church, was salvation. But their means was radically different. The papacy could not renounce its sacraments or its priesthood, nor could it admit that faith in God might be something other than the mandates of Rome. The Waldenses came to feel more and more that no teaching except Christ was binding. The Scriptures must rule. This back to the Bible movement is referred to by some as the Reformers before the Reformation. But their view of salvation, a life of penance and poverty, lacks the clear note of God's grace that sounded so powerfully in the Reformation. The pearl of new heresies. A third dissenting movement was the group called Cathari, which means pure ones. Some called themselves Albigenses because they were especially influential in and around the world of Albi in southern France. Like the Gnostics in the early church, the Cathari held that the universe is the scene of an eternal conflict between two powers, the one good, the other evil. Matter, including the human body, is the work of this evil power. The God of the Old Testament, he had, they claimed, imprisoned the soul in its earthly body. A cosmic war raged between matter and spirit, and the Cathari joined the ranks of the spirit. The Cathari were heretical in a way Arnold and Waldo were not. Arnold and Waldo refused to submit to church authorities, but the Cathari rejected not only popes and bishops, but basic Christianity according to their persecutors. They tried to escape from evil, not by repentance and faith, but by dividing the self in two. These heretical teachings were spreading at an alarming rate. Three weapons were at the Catholic Church's disposal. Number one, preaching to return them to the truth. Number two, a crusade to crush all the hardened resistance. And thirdly, the Inquisition to uproot heresy completely. The popes tried sending preachers among the Cathari, but they were notoriously ineffective. Dominic Guzman, in 1170 to 1221, discovered the reason. The papally assigned preachers were depending upon their pomp and dignity. The Cathari considered such show a sure sign of false religion. Dominic believed the heretics would listen if the preachers themselves were committed to poverty. To win heretics, Dominic went among them as a poor man, barefoot and begging. Convinced that poverty and preaching belonged together, he gathered a group of like-minded men and continued his work among the heretics in other places. In 1220, the Dominican lifestyle gained official approval. The new preaching order we know as Dominicans was called mendicant, meaning begging. And the term friar or brother distinguished them from monks because, unlike monks, they went to live among people to preach and teach. These mendicant friars emerged to meet the spiritual needs of townspeople. Meanwhile, Innocent III was determined to crush the Cathari heresy. The northern French were hoping for a chance to gobble up southern France, then a separate country. When the Innocent called for a crusade, not against Muslim Turks, but against Christian heretics, northern France came pillaging and murdering. It's often that good Christian men can save their souls and at the same time enlarge their kingdoms by butchering unbelievers. By 1215, the Cathari had been uprooted and the northern French had claimed the ravaged territories of the south. The purpose of the Inquisition was to hound out scattered heretics. Today the term is equated with the ruthless miscarriage of justice. The early form of the Inquisition appeared in 1184 when Pope Lucas III required bishops to inquire into the beliefs of their subjects. Heresy or harboring a heretic brought immediate excommunication. The spread of the Waldenses and Cathari called for stricter measures. In 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council, under Innocent III's leadership, provided for the state's punishment of heretics, the confiscation of their property, excommunication for those unwilling to move against the heretic, and complete forgiveness of sins for those cooperating. In 1220, the Pope took the Inquisition from the hands of the bishops and turned it over to the Dominicans. In 1229, the Synod of Toulouse systemized inquisitorial policies, leaving the alleged heretic with virtually no rights. The inquisitor was subject to no law, only to the Pope. He was prosecutor and judge. The trial was secret, and the accused had to prove his innocence without the benefit of counsel or knowledge of his accusers. In 1252, Innocent IV authorized torture as a means of getting information and confession from accused heretics. Canon law forbade a cleric from shedding blood. He could only hound, interrogate, and torture the prisoner. If he found the person guilty of heresy, he turned him over to civil authorities, usually for burning at the stake. The combination of the crusade against heresy in Toulouse and the Inquisition brought an end to Carthusianism. Before the end of the 13th century, the Waldenses, targets of the same Inquisition, survived in the mountains of Italy and welcomed the Reformation when it broke over Europe in the 16th century. Giovanni Bernardone, better known as St. Francis of Assisi, 1182 to 1226, was the son of a wealthy Italian merchant, for whom his father had dreams of knighthood. However, one minor military campaign was enough for him. While racked with fever, while imprisoned as a prisoner of war, meditating on the meaning of life, Francis chose to turn his back on his father's world. Leaving home in a ragged cloak and a rope belt taken from a scarecrow, he wandered the countryside with a few followers, begging from the rich, giving to the poor, and preaching the joys of apostolic poverty. In 1209, Francis prepared a simple rule for his brotherhood. It consisted chiefly of Christ's appeal to take up the cross, his advice to the rich young ruler, and his directions on sending out the apostles. Francis called this group the Friars Minor, lesser brothers. We call them the Franciscans. Pope Gregory IX admired Francis greatly, recognizing the possibilities of the movement as an agent for the advancement of the Roman Church, especially where its authority had been undermined by Arnold, Waldo, and the Cathari. He would reform the church by giving the Franciscans authority. Francis wanted to reform the world by preaching Christ-like humility. The Franciscans joined the Dominicans in a great mendicant counter-offensive in the preaching, doctrine, and dedication. For another century, the Franciscans were divided between the conventuals, who allowed the church to hold poverty for Franciscan use, and the spirituals, who argued that complete poverty was an indispensable note of the true church. Thus, Lady Poverty remained a challenge to the church of wealth and power, but like Innocent III's vision of universal dominion, it proved an impossibility for the whole church for all times. Section number 6, the law of necessity. On February the 22nd, 1300, Pope Boniface the VIII proclaimed a jubilee, a holy year, to celebrate the new centenary of Christ's birth. It was the first of its kind. The official decree announced a full and copious pardon of all their sins for all who reverently visited the churches of St. Peter and St. Paul during the Holy Year. Throngs poured into the eternal city. Following his example, Pope the Sixth announced 1975 would be another holy year. The gift of plenary indulgence were Paul's words. Several times during the Holy Year, Boniface appeared before the pilgrims in his imperial robes, crying, "I am Caesar, I am emperor." His papal crown is said to have contained 48 rubies, 72 sapphires, 45 emeralds, and 66 large pearls. He could afford to be generous and with pardons for spiritual pilgrims. One chronicler reported that at the church of St. Paul, the pilgrims kept 2 priests busy night and day, raking together infinite money. In the midst of pomp and circumstances, forces were at work that marked the beginning of the end of the medieval papal sovereignty. Significant changes often take place in the world and in the church, and men are often totally unaware of what's happening. The 14th century was such a time. The papacy continued its business as usual attitude, while important ideas and social forces changed the face of Christianity. The period between 1300 and 1500 is often referred to as the decline of the Middle Ages, because the idea of Christendom, which unified the millennium between the 4th and the 14th centuries was under attack. Christendom was made possible by the harmony of two ideas: the Christian empire and the Catholic Church. The image of a Christian empire, useful in creating unified Europe in the 7th and 8th centuries, failed in importance in the 12th and 13th centuries as papal influence spread. The significance of the 14th and 15th centuries lies not only in the further decline of the empire, but in the dramatic loss of papal prestige. During the 14th century, more and more people were getting used to the idea that they were English or French. Whenever their thoughts reached beyond their own town or religion, they found it possible to think of their state functioning without direct papal guidance. In modern terms, they began to think of secular and sacred affairs, a realm for the state as well as a realm for the church. Europe was slowly moving away from its feudal past. Land became less important. Hard cash was the new thing. Men at the top of the power structure realized they needed greater sources of revenue. This required a broader authority to tax. The struggle between church and national monarchies of England and France touched off the turmoil of the 14th century. To finance costly campaigns, Edward of England and Philip of France hit upon the same solution: tax the clergy within their realms. But in the Pope's view, church revenues were exempt from assessment and taxable only by the church. In 1296, Boniface VIII issued his Clerics Laicos, a document threatening excommunication for any ruler who taxed the clergy and any churchman who paid those taxes without papal consent. Edward responded by decreeing that if the clergy did not pay, they would be stripped of all legal protection, and their extensive properties would be seized by the king's sheriffs. Philip's answer was to place a complete embargo on the export of all gold, silver, and jewels from his domains, thus depriving the papal treasury of major sources of revenue from church collections in France. Boniface backed down, claiming he had not meant to cut off clerical contributions for defense in times of dire need. The kings would decide what defense and dire need meant. Because of the success of the Jubilee year, Boniface concluded that the spiritual reverence manifested for him in every corner of Christendom extended the civil sphere as well. He had a second circlet added to his crown as a symbol of his temporal sovereignty. His first target was the French monarch Philip. Philip, however, held that Jesus Christ gave the church no temporal authority. Battle ensued between the two, leading the Pope's issuance of his unam sanction, the most extreme assertion of papal power in all church history. It is altogether necessary, he declared, for every human being to be subject to the Roman pontiff. The king's counter-move was no less drastic. He moved to have Boniface deposed on the ground that his election had been illegal. The case against Boniface included not only the illegitimacy of his election, but heresy, simony, and immorality. Upon authority given by an assembly of French nobles and churchmen, the Pope was found summering in the town of Anagni. He was captured and held prisoner for several days until the people of the town discovered what had happened. They rescued the elderly Pope, who died within weeks of the incident. The significance of this episode reveals that European Christians no longer accepted papal interference in what they regarded as purely political matters. No one could say with certainty what a purely political matter was, but a king's power within his own country was generally accepted as a fact. At the same time, outrage against a pope was widely resented. Few men at that time could conceive of Christianity without the Holy Father. Even when they had no political terms for it, men in the early 14th century were beginning to distinguish secular and religious authority and to recognize the rights of each in its own place. Boniface's successor in Rome died after a brief ineffectual reign in 1305. The College of Cardinals elected a Frenchman, the Archbishop of Bordeaux, as Pope Clement V. Clement never set foot in Rome, preferring to stay closer to home where he was always accessible to royal bidding. Clement's election marked the beginning of the 72-year period in church history called the Babylonian captivity of the papacy. After the long exile of the ancient Jews in Babylon, following Clement, 6 successive popes, all French, chose to reside in Avignon rather than Rome. The removal of the papacy from Avignon was more than a matter of geography in the thinking of European people. Rome stood not only for the idea of the apostolic succession of the church founded upon Peter, but also the concept of Western universality. Roman Imperium. Avignon, on the other hand, was surrounded on all sides by the French kingdom and was a tool in the hands of the power of hungry French. Avignon papacy was bitterly resented in Germany. In 1324, the Emperor Louis the Bavarian, 1314 to 1347, moved against Pope John the 22nd by appealing to a general council. In 1326, Marcellus of Padua had fled from the University of Paris, and his colleague John of Jandun presented Louis with their work entitled Defender of the Peace, which questioned the whole papal structure of the church and called for democratic government. The Defender of the Peace asserted that the church was the community of all believers and that the priesthood was not superior to the laity. Neither popes nor bishops nor priests had received any special function from Christ. They served only as agents of the community of believers, which was represented by the General Council. This radical and revolutionary view of the church transformed the papacy into the executive office of the council and subordinated the pope to authority of the council. The theory, called conciliarism, would soon find a place not only in theory but in fact. Most of the hostility aimed at the Avignon papacy complained of the use and abuse of money. There were fees for the privileges and taxes for that. The popes introduced a new rule that whenever a bishop was appointed, the first year's income, called an annat, should go to the pope. To fill a vacancy, popes often transferred a bishop from another city and thus created more annates. Or perhaps the pope delayed the appointment and received all the income in the interim. This was called a reservation. The most lucrative of practices, however, was the granting of indulgences. The bitter feelings against the papacy increased, especially when the Holy Father demanded this tax or that revenue under threats of excommunication. By 1360, turmoil in Italy over the papal states, plus the outcries against the French domination of the papacy, made it clear that the Avignon papacy could not continue indefinitely. In 1377, Pope Gregory XI re-entered Rome, but his death within a year of his arrival required a new election. The College of Cardinals, still predominantly French, yielded to the clamor of a Roman mob and chose an Italian. On April the 18th, 1378, the new pope, Urban VI, was crowned with all cardinals present. However, Urban's dictatorial ways brought second thoughts about his selection. In August, the cardinals suddenly informed all Europe that the people of Rome had forced the election of an apostate to the chair of Peter, and the proceedings were invalid. A month later, the apostate responded by creating a new college of cardinals. The French cardinals chose another pope from their own number, Clement VII, who moved about Italy for a time and then eventually sailed for France and Avignon.